Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for our webinar on CAST prep, 3D item analysis, and strategies for student readiness. If you haven't already done so, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself in the chat. Like I mentioned, it's just nice to see who all is here and who's joining us today. Also, make sure that you change it to say to everyone. That way, everybody can see your responses rather than to just the hosts and panelists. And like I promised, we shall go ahead and introduce ourselves now. So my name is Emily Miller. My pronouns are she, her. Prior to coming to Inner Orbit, I was a high school chemistry teacher for 10 years in Minnesota. And during that time, I taught in our alternative learning program. I taught regular chem, honors chem, so lots of ways to teach a lot of different kids. I worked a lot with the NGSS within my time in the classroom, and I also got to be a PLC lead, which I loved, so lots of data-driven dialogue. And now I have the joy of partnering with districts to help them implement Inner Orbit. And true story, I actually don't know who's even playing in the Super Bowl. Like, I don't even know who the two teams are. So that's probably embarrassing. And I'll go ahead and pass it off to Julia.
Well, good for you. I think you're not the only one. But hey, everybody. My name is Julia Mota. I was a teacher and a tutor for elementary students in the Dominican Republic, and I've been supporting teachers with their NGSS implementation for the past 4 years. I'm now partnering and providing guidance to schools and districts with implementing NGSS assessment in their instruction. And I honestly thought that the Bears would make it this year. I don't know anything about football, but it was fun. People explained it to me rather recently. And in Chicago, people were like really rooting for them. So I was rooting for them. But anyway, they're not a great team. I'm just glad that they got to the playoffs, I think is how they're called. Anyway, I'm going to be in the chat answering questions. So if you have any questions, I'll be there and I'll pass it off to Daniel.
Hey everyone, my name's Daniel Jackson. I was formerly a curriculum director, high school biology, and middle school science teacher for 11 years in education. I taught at an international school in Colombia. I was a global education and Fulbright TGC scholar in Morocco, and now I partner with school leaders and teachers new to Inner Orbit. And for the Super Bowl, I'm a big fan, but once a year, I like to say. So I definitely try to keep up enough to know what's going on, but then I really get into it these upcoming weeks to see who's going to win. But all right, let's go over our agenda for today. Our goal is to cover the structure and the expectations of the California Science Test, the CAST, be able to identify the NGSS dimensions within CAST items, and learn how scaffolded formative assessments can support student progression towards confidently answering 3D phenomena-driven questions. We'll be together for about 45 minutes. I'll give an overview of Inner Orbit. Next, we'll cover the shift to sense making, and I'll talk through some assessments that align with the CAST. From there, we'll go over the CAST structure and item analysis, along with examples of scaffolded formatives from Inner Orbit that can help teachers prepare students for the CAST. We will also provide helpful resources for phenomena-based questions towards the end. And so with that, get started we shall, which is my best Yoda impression there, but I know we have some Star Wars fans here. But all right, to kick us off, I'll begin with a quick introduction to what Inner Orbit is and how it supports educators. At Inner Orbit, we'd like to say there are three core components to what we do. We have phenomena, we have assessments, and we have detailed reports. Our high integrity 3D assessments at Inner Orbit are designed to provide meaningful and actionable student data so educators can make informed instructional decisions with confidence. We also make the NGSS accessible for both you and your students through innovative approaches to sense making. That means we don't just drop students straight into these complex 3D questions. Instead, we use scaffolded prompts that move students from more basic one-dimensional content-focused understanding towards those larger three-dimensional questions, which we'll talk about in just a bit. And in addition to the questions themselves, we also provide supporting activities you can use with your students to help build the understanding over time, so they're prepared and confident when they reach those more rigorous summative assessments later on, such as on the CAST. We also provide guidance, supporting resources, and professional development to help you reach your NGSS goals, just like the session we're having today. There will be a link dropped in the chat in just a moment. If you're interested in learning more about Inner Orbit, feel free to fill out that interest form, and from there, we'll share additional information and show you how you all can try Inner Orbit within your districts. Next, I want to talk about the shift to sense making in regards to how we can interpret proficiency when prepping for the CAST. And if you've been teaching for years, you probably felt this huge shift already. Proficiency has moved from standards that often focused on isolated facts, content, or skills to performance expectations that describe what students should actually be able to do to demonstrate understanding. Under the NGSS, proficiency is defined by sense making, which is when students integrate the three dimensions to explain phenomena and solve problems, not just recall information. Now let's take a look at those three dimensions of the NGSS. As you may know, the three dimensions are what sit at the heart of the NGSS. First, we have the disciplinary core ideas. These are the content, the science that students are learning. In this example, the DCI we're focusing on is adaptation. Students need to understand that in a given habitat, some organisms survive well, some survive less well, and some cannot survive at all. That understanding is a critical part of the content students are expected to learn. Although on its own, that kind of recall is no longer sufficient to say a student is proficient. The second dimension is the science and engineering practices. This is what students are actually doing with the science. Practices include things like constructing arguments, analyzing data, and developing or using models. In other words, thinking and acting like scientists. In this performance expectation, students are asked to engage in argument from evidence, meaning they must construct a claim and support it with evidence based on what they've learned about adaptation. And finally, we have cross-cutting concepts. These are the big ideas that are connected across scientific disciplines. They shape how students think about science. Examples include patterns, systems, and cause and effect. In this example here, the cross-cutting concept is cause and effect. Students need to reason through how certain traits or conditions in a habitat cause one organism to survive better than others. When all three of these dimensions come together, we get a much clearer picture of what students truly understand. We're no longer just measuring what they can memorize, we're assessing how they think, reason, and apply their knowledge. And that's a key difference with three-dimensional sense-making focused assessments. Next, let's talk a little bit more about sense-making. So when we say sense-making, we're talking about what happens when students pull together everything they already know, their ideas, their skills, their experiences, to make sense of something they don't fully understand yet. That process usually begins with a phenomena that's puzzling and raises questions. From there, students might use science and engineering practices to investigate. Maybe they ask questions, analyze data, or construct explanations, while at the same time drawing on those disciplinary core ideas and cross-cutting concepts. As we can see in the image, sense-making isn't expected to be linear. Students won't always move step by step in a straight line. Instead, they can move back and forth between practices, content, and cross-cutting concepts as they refine their understanding. Rather than jumping straight to the right answer, they're working to figure out why something is happening. They're testing ideas, revising their thinking, and asking better questions along the way. That's really what the NGSS is aiming for, and what we believe strong assessments and strong instruction should be designed to support. Students that show proficiency are able to bring all these pieces together to make sense of new or novel scenarios. Now that we've gone over sense making, I'll pass it over to Emily to show you how sense making is incorporated into the CAST assessment.
All right. Thank you, Daniel. We always just like to do a general overview initially of just the NGSS, the different dimensions and sense making to make sure we're all on the same page before actually diving into the CAST, which utilizes all of those NGSS terminologies and fun facts. So first, we're going to just talk about the structure of the CAST and what that's going to look like when students actually take it. So on a really high level, the CAST is actually 6 different segments. The first 2 to 3 segments are going to be composed of discrete items. Discrete items are essentially standalone items. So these aren't necessarily tied to they're usually still real world situations, but it's not like a lengthy passage or phenomena that they need to continuously keep referring to. And these questions don't build on top of one another like the performance task questions do. Segment 3 is either going to be more discrete items or a performance task, but the last 3 segments are definitely going to be those performance tasks. Each task is going to be about 4 to 6 questions, and all of those questions are going to connect back to that same phenomena. So that's that key difference between the discrete ones versus the performance tasks, is those questions kind of slowly build on each other over time. Since there's going to be a guaranteed 3 performance tasks, each performance task is going to connect to one of the larger content areas. So there's going to be 1 life science, 1 earth and space science, and 1 physical science task for sure. Also, when we're looking at the CAST, it's given at 5th grade, 8th grade, and high school. And that 5th grade CAST is actually going to be comprehensive over all of the elementary performance expectations. 8th grade is going to be all the middle school performance expectations, and high school is going to be all the high school performance expectations. So this is something that's really important to keep in mind when you're trying to prep and review and get students ready for the CAST. Because for example, if they are in 11th grade and they're taking chemistry, there's still going to be biology content on the CAST that they might not have seen for a year or 2. So being able to help and support them with older content can help them feel a little bit more confident before they're actually going into it. Now, this chart is a little intimidating, but this gives you an idea of the different types of questions that are going to be asked on the cast. So this is the 5th grade blueprint. So how we can look at this is up at the top, we've got our different DCIs. So we've got physical science, life science, earth and space, and then the main domains within them. Then right beneath, we've got the cross-cutting concepts. And then along the sides here, we've got the science and engineering practices, or the SEPs. So where you can see that these X's forming here is there's going to be something about physical science that has to do with cross-cutting concept 3 and SEP 3. Now this isn't necessarily, there's going to be at least one of these items on the cast, but as you can see here, there's a range for how many there could be in total. So this kind of lets you kind of line up what SEPs and cross-cutting concepts and DCIs are going to be combined, and essentially they're combined by the standard. What I found really interesting while looking at this, which might be like a bigger takeaway overall, is that students for the most part are going to be asked 3-dimensional questions and a couple 2-dimensional SEP questions. There's not going to really be any 2D CCC questions, and a majority of them are going to utilize all 3 dimensions. So making sure that you're giving students practice with 3-dimensional items is going to be huge. The other big takeaway that I saw is that at each grade level, so 5th grade, 8th grade, and 11th grade, it seemed that some SEPs tended to have a heavier focus. So for example, here at this 5th grade, there's a heavier focus on developing and using models, planning and carrying out investigations, constructing explanations, and engaging in argument from evidence. Now, historically, what we've seen at Inner Orbit is students tend to need more support with the science and engineering practices in comparison to the DCIs and the CCCs. So when you're looking to help support your students to taking these 3-dimensional questions, knowing that 4 out of the 8 SEPs might have a larger focus can kind of help you zero in a little bit more on where you might want to help support them more moving forward. Now, we can look at a similar fun chart here for 8th grade as well. So this is broken down in that same way where we've got the DCIs and the content domains along the top. We've got the CCCs, and then we've got the SEPs along the side. Again, the big takeaway here is that students are going to be asked primarily 3-dimensional questions with some 2D SEP questions. And at the 8th grade level, the SEPs that are going to have a heavier focus is still going to be developing and using models. If you look here, it looks like they could be asked from 1 to 16 items, which is a lot. Analyzing, interpreting data, constructing explanations. Again, there's a range of 1 to 12 for constructing explanations, and then engaging in an argument from evidence again. Now, looking at high school, again, the same breakdown and same setup here. Again, they're going to be asked primarily 3-dimensional questions. And the SEPs that are going to have a heavier focus at this level is, again, developing and using models, using mathematics and computational thinking, constructing explanations, and engaging in argument from evidence. I do want to point out that this does have a little bit more of a widespread. So the amount of questions are going to be divided up amongst the SCPs a little bit more equitably at this level, but still there are some that are potentially going to be more prevalent than others. Now, the next thing I want to talk about in terms of the cast is something that we call cast cut scores. So when we're looking at this is letting us know the minimum scores that students can get, the maximum scores they can get on the cast, and the range of scores to get either a level 1, level 2, level 3, or level 4. Now, me looking at this as a teacher, I have a hard time kind of breaking down what we're talking about. So to make things a little bit easier on our end here at Inner Orbit and for teachers, what we tried to do is we tried to break down these numbers into percentages to fit and align more with what we're doing in our day-to-day classrooms. So, for example, the minimum score on the 5th grade test is 150. The maximum score is 250. That means there's 100 points that students could earn on the 5th grade test. The same goes for the 8th grade because there's a range of 350 to 450, and the high school 550 to 650. So there's a total points available of 100 for each of the tests. Now we're aiming for that level 3. So that level 3 is marked as proficient. They are on grade level. They're doing what they need to do. So in order to get a 3 on the 5th grade test, students need to get at least a 214, at least a 415, and then at least a 615. Don't worry, I did the math for you. So what this means is on the 5th grade test, they have to get about 64 points, 65 points on the 8th grade, and 65 points on the high school. Now remember, there was 100 points available. So if there's 100 points available and they got to get 64 or 65, in order to reach proficiency, students need to get about 64 to 65% of the questions correct. Now, I don't know about you, but my teacher brain is programmed to see 64 and 65 and think D, which isn't necessarily so hot. But what's nice with this is when you're taking that frame of reference and when you're giving these students these really rigorous three-dimensional items, we're not necessarily measuring them at that same expectation that we're doing in a day-to-day general ABCD grade format. So as you're giving students opportunities to practice these cast-like items, keep in mind that proficiency of 64 to 65% is kind of what we're aiming for and could get them that level 3 when actually taking the assessment. So now that we actually spent some time talking about what can be expected on the cast, the different types of questions that are going to be on it, and the cut scores, what I want to do now is actually do a deep dive into an 8th grade practice item. What I want to do here is I want to show you how the 3 dimensions play into the item to show how these questions are 3-dimensional. And then I want to show you a way that you can scaffold your students up to answer these rigorous 3-dimensional questions. So when looking at this 8th grade item, I'm pulling this from one of the practice tests here on the cast. And this question is looking at the standard MS-LS 4-4. So construct an explanation based on evidence that describes how genetic variations of traits in a population increase some individuals' probability of surviving and reproducing in a specific environment. So this is the standard that this question is assessing. The SEP that students are going to be expected to do is constructing explanations and designing solutions. The DCI, the content that they're going to be responsible for, is natural selection. And the cross-cutting concept is going to be cause and effect. So students are going to have to utilize their ability to construct explanations, utilize their knowledge of natural selection, and think about this through the lens of cause and effect in order to tackle this question. So let's take a look. This is from a performance task. So this means there's multiple questions about this phenomena within the cast. And this is the phenomena that students are going to continuously need to refer back to in order to answer the questions. And this one is all about squirrels. So to save you the time, essentially what this is talking about is that there is a genetic mutation that can change the amount of melanin levels in squirrels, giving different variations of one species of squirrel. So even though these are eastern gray squirrels, you can see them either being gray, dark brown, or black due to the genetic mutation, increasing the amount of melanin within the squirrels. Down here, we have a graph that shows the percentage of each color type over the course of a few different years. So I took away some of the phenomena in order to make room for other things. So I kind of left here what we need in order to answer the question. Unfortunately, our students do not have the same ability to erase some information. But this is the question that students are going to be asked. Explain how the pattern in the graph supports the claim that the genetic mutation for black fur was at sometimes harmful and at other times helpful to survival. Enter your answer in the box provided. I'm the Star Wars fan, by the way, when Daniel mentioned that. So please forgive me for the few Star Wars gifts I put in here. I got a bad feeling about this, shall we? So this is a pretty complex answer. And not only that, it's a constructed response. So students have to physically type out their answer to this as well. So there's not a lot of supports in place for them to be able to answer this. So first, I want to talk about how the 3 dimensions are within this. So you can see how students can utilize those skills. And then I'm going to talk you through how we can scaffold students to be able to eventually answer questions like this confidently. So the 3 dimensions, again, that are at play in this problem is constructing explanations and designing solutions. That's the SCP, the DCI of natural selection, and the cross-cutting concept of cause and effect. So first, I want to take a moment and see how the SCP is played into this question. Since students need to construct explanations and design solutions, right away in the question, it's asking them to explain how the pattern in the graph supports the claim. So we've got a claim here that black fur was sometimes harmful and sometimes helpful, and students need to get evidence from the graph in order to support that claim. So that is the skill that students are going to have to do here, is extrapolate evidence from the graph and then use that to support the claim that is being made about the survival of black squirrels. Now, natural selection is the DCI component of this. And in this case, students need to understand that certain genetic traits can affect the survival of different organisms, and that can then also have an effect over the general population. So for example, as we can see here with the black squirrels, over time, the amount of black squirrels increases and then it slowly decreases. So understanding that the fact that they had black fur, that genetic trait, had an effect on their survival over time and the ability to pass on that gene over time as well. And then lastly, the cross-cutting concept of cause and effect. Here, it's this idea that genetic mutation for black fur can cause either black squirrels not surviving and it being harmful to them, or being helpful to them to survive. So in looking at this question, students need to gather evidence to support a claim. They have to understand natural selection and then see the cause and effect mechanism behind that genetic trait and the survival of these squirrels. It's a lot that students need to gather and put together into one question here. So before we talk about how we can scaffold students to be able to confidently answer a question like that, I just want to quick review the overall ideas of the cast here. So as a reminder, there are 6 segments on the cast. The first 2 segments are going to have discrete items. Those are standalone items. And then the last 4 to 6 for sure, maybe 3 to 6 will be performance tasks. So they're going to have a phenomena like that squirrel phenomena, and then there's going to be multiple questions about that same phenomena that students will need to go back and answer. There's going to be at least 1 life science performance expectation, 1 earth and space science, and 1 physical science. And that 5th grade cast is going to be looking at all the elementary standards, 8th grade, middle school, high school. We'll look at all the high school standards as well. Students are going to be asked mostly 3-dimensional questions. So we want to make sure that we're giving students questions that are integrating all 3 dimensions. And it's also nice to know that certain SCPs have heavier focuses at different grade levels. So if you're looking for a spot to really zoom in and focus, that could be one area to help you. And also keeping in mind when we're giving students these rigorous 3-dimensional items, proficiency, that level 3 that we're aiming for is more at that 64-65%. So having a different focus when you're looking at student performance in this as well. So how can we scaffold? How can we get them to do this sense making? Like Daniel mentioned at the beginning, there has been this big shift in science education where we're not just expecting students to know and recall facts and information, we're asking them to actually demonstrate their understanding in various ways. And this is a big leap for some students. But as Han Solo said, never tell me the odds. We can figure this out.
Who's at the front door?
So one thing that we've done here at Inner Orbit is we've written questions in a way that slowly scaffold up to that 3-dimensional rigor. So rather than throwing them in the deep end and saying, hey, use all 3 dimensions and go for it, we have written our questions in a way that slowly bring them to that level. The first type of question that we offer on our site is actually a 1-dimensional question. So DCI only. That means this is just content. Now, we do want to eventually move away from content-only questions, but this is a good place to start because if students don't know what natural selection is, they're going to have a hard time even starting to construct an explanation about the squirrels to begin with. So this is ensuring that students know that content and know that information. And then, I don't know if you can hear my ring, but my children are ringing my doorbell because that's fun. After that, we have 2-dimensional questions on our site. These questions still have content associated with them, but then we practice one at a time, layering in either the cross-cutting concept or the science and engineering practice on top of the content. So rather than expecting them to do all 3 dimensions at once, we're just having them do 2 dimensions at once. One, this is nice for students to slowly practice these skills individually. And second, it gives you really valuable data and insights to how they're doing on these various dimensions so you can give more targeted support. And then lastly, we offer on our site, obviously, 3-dimensional questions, which is ultimately what we're aiming for. Because if students can do all 3 dimensions with a novel phenomena, we can consider them to be proficient with that performance expectation. So we're going to be looking at how we can scaffold students to answer questions about MSLS 4.4, which is the same standard that that squirrel phenomena in question was asking us about. So the phenomena on Inner Orbit that we're going to be looking at is actually all about snails instead of squirrels. So the idea here is that there are snails and there are 2 different birds that live in this habitat. And these different birds target the snail, different types of snails based on how those birds hunt. So we have a limpkin and a snail kite, and we've got different graphs here showing us the types of snail shells that were consumed by these different types of birds over time. And again, this is all about that MSLS 4.4 standard, which is the same standard that that squirrel question was about. So when looking at this phenomena, again, we're talking about how we can slowly scaffold students to answer a 3-dimensional question about this phenomena. So the first question I want to look at that I pulled from Inner Orbit is this. If a snail lives longer, it's blank to be able to blank. So I have a question for all of you right now. So now that you have this idea of 1-dimensional, 2-dimensional, and 3-dimensional, I'm curious if you wouldn't mind putting down into the chat. Do you think this question is 1-dimensional and is only looking at content? In our Orbit website, we have classified this as a 1-dimensional DCI only question. The reason for that is we're really just hitting at that idea of natural selection. So this idea that if snails live longer, it's more likely to be able to pass on its genes. So this idea that different organisms that have genetic traits that are favorable in that environment, they'll be able to live, pass on their DNA, and therefore pass on those genetic traits over time. So same phenomena, but now I've got another question for you. So this question is based on figure 4, which of these statements correctly describes the likely effect of snail kites on future snail populations? So give y'all another chance. What do you think? Do you think this question is 1D, 2D? We have classified this question on our site as a two-dimensional question, specifically a 2D CCC question. Remember, the cross-cutting concept here is cause and effect. So again, we're looking at the idea of which of these statements correctly describes the likely effect of snail kites on future snail populations. So we're looking at which one of these will affect that population over time. The next question we have is refer to figure 3. A classmate states that the size of the shell does not impact a snail's ability to survive. Do you agree with the claim about the snail size? So is this a 1D, 2D, or 3D question? This is a 2D question, specifically a 2D SEP question. So the SEP is all about constructing explanations and designing solutions. So in this case, we have a claim that is being made, and so students are then looking to see if they can find evidence to support that claim or not. The next question we have here is referring to information in figure 4. So we have a new graph here. Your class collected the data shown above on a population of snails living amongst snail kites, which claim best explains the change in the snail population from year 1 to year 2. This question is a three-dimensional question. In this case, we're still asking them to use that SEP of constructing explanations and designing solutions. And then we're looking at that cause and effect. So looking at that change from year 1 to year 2, what caused that change and having more dark snails in that second year. And then the last question I have for you here is now an open-ended question. So how does a snail population provide an example of natural selection? Use evidence from the figures and text to explain how certain traits may affect a snail's probability of surviving and reproducing in this environment. This is a three-dimensional question. So this question, while not exactly the same as the squirrel question, is similar in essence, where students need to go back and they need to look at graphs, they need to get some data from it, they need to come up with a claim, and then from there, they need to provide evidence for it and look at that cause and effect mechanism of natural selection. So by first assessing students on just content, seeing if they understand the information, and then slowly layering in the SEP and the CCC, this gives students an opportunity to practice these and see if they can do these in isolation. And then it also gives you data to see if one of these particular skills students need more support with. You can then scaffold that further by giving students a multiple choice question that is three-dimensional, so there's a little bit more scaffolds in place. And then from there, you can give them open-ended constructed response questions like the squirrel one to see if they can do it on their own. So using this scaffolding structure of 1D, 2D to 3D is a way that you can slowly give your students supports to eventually answer those three-dimensional rigorous questions on their own. And the nice thing with Inner Orbit is we have some of these scaffolded assessments already ready to go and pre-made for you. So for example, let's say you're teaching 8th grade and you just finished up some lessons on natural selection. You can go ahead and head to our site. And if you happen to be using one of these curriculum, you also don't have to be using one of these curriculum. This is just one way to navigate our site. If you're doing Open SciEd, you just taught this unit, you can look at our formative assessments that we've already made, and then you can go ahead and grab that and assign it. And these formative assessments already have that scaffolding of 1D, 2D to 3D. So you can get that snapshot picture of how your students are doing on those different levels of questions. And then looking at the data, you can see what they may need next. Daniel's actually going to be talking more about the data here in just a moment. From there, Daniel's going to now talk us through some of the data that you can then get from Inner Orbit to help you decide next steps.
Thank you, Emily. Well, as we know in science, data is everything. So let's take a look at what the data can look like and the insights it provides when you give an assessment on Inner Orbit. Because all Inner Orbit summative items are 2 or 3 dimensional, just like on every question includes either a science and engineering practice or a cross-cutting concept or both. This allows teachers and admin to look beyond missed standards and actually identify patterns across students, classrooms, and schools. The dimensions report here provides the insight by showing performance across the specific elements of each of the 3 dimensions and allowing you all to drill down by grade, school, and class. This helps you target instruction, support learning across multiple performance expectations, and better align your preparation to state assessments like the CAST. Now let's zoom out to a district level view. This is one of my favorite reports because it really highlights why looking at science and engineering practices and cross-cutting concepts is so powerful. At the top, you see the different dimensions, and down the side, you see the different schools in the district, And in the table, you can see the performance across the district. In this example, you can quickly see differences between schools, such as School 2 struggling with the SEP of constructing explanations and designing solutions, while School 5 is performing at a much better in that same area. That easy contrast opens the door for meaningful collaboration, allowing educators to ask what's working in one school and how those strategies can be shared across the district. Now let's zoom in to the teacher level view and look at students' performance on individual questions. So in this example, we can see that students tend to do well on the 1D DCI only questions and continue to perform strongly on the 2D question where a cross-cutting concept is added. However, we begin to see a drop when a science and engineering practice is introduced in the other 2D question, and an even larger drop when all three dimensions are included in the last question. Because that same SEP appears in both the 2D and 3D questions, we can identify that as a key area where students need more targeted support, rather than unnecessarily reviewing the DCI that they are already doing well on. That's the real power of this data. It helps us move beyond just what students missed to focusing on why it was missed, so that instruction can be adjusted with intention. While assessment is a crucial component in helping students prepare for the CAST, Inner Orbit also has created some more informal sense-making activities to help students practice. I'm going to share one of those activities with you called the Science Talks that helps with targeting these supports in the classroom and can be implemented right away. In the Science Talks activity, students engage in a facilitated discussion around a novel phenomena, exploring questions, sharing ideas, and collaboratively building understanding. Teachers will select a phenomena from our library, and students will work together to unpack it using all three dimensions while they collaborate to highlight the bigger patterns or relationships they notice. It's important to note that this activity is a scaffolded support and not another test. So once teachers see data that show students are struggling with 3D questions, the next step could be to provide this type of structured sense-making practice in the classroom. And teachers can run science talks at any point of the year to help students become more comfortable making sense of phenomena out loud and together. By practicing this way, when students encounter a 3D question or an assessment like the CAST, it doesn't feel like an entirely new task. Instead, it's the same kind of thinking they've been practicing in class. These science talks promote collaborative sense-making and help students ask better questions and connect their prior knowledge to new concepts as they get prepared for the CAST. This can be a great informal first step for CAST preparation that can be implemented right away. All right, that's all we have planned for today. I'm going to pass it off to Emily to wrap up the webinar.
Thank you, Daniel. So just a quick recap what we did here today. We talked about the structure and expectations of the CAST. We talked about how we can identify those three different NGSS dimensions within CAST items, and then talked about how we can use scaffolded formative assessments to help students eventually gain that confidence to answer those three-dimensional rigorous questions. As a reminder, students are going to be asked 2D and 3D questions. So we really want to make sure we're supporting them with the SCPs and the CCCs. And keeping in mind too that proficiency is going to be around that 64-65%. So while we are asking them these rigorous questions, we are looking at a different percentage goal than for proficiency from there. One final time, Julia is going to drop into the chat our interest form. Again, this is not a commitment. This is just letting us know that you might be interested in learning more about Inner Orbit and how you could potentially pilot this with your schools or your district or with your teachers. We also have more videos like this on our YouTube channel at Inner Orbit NGSS, and you can also email us at inquiries@innerorbit.com if you've got further questions. Thank you so much for being with us here this afternoon. It was a pleasure being able to speak with all of you. And as Han said, may the force be with you. Daniel and Julia and I will hang out for a couple of minutes in case anybody has any questions that they would like to get answered. Otherwise, feel free to fill out that interest form or email us at inquiries@innerorbit.com, and we would be happy to help you out there as well. But thank you again for joining us.